Now when we look at timelines more specifically then, the definition is for timelines you've got that linear representation of the events. They're in order just as they were with the chronology, but often with timelines then you have the scaling guidelines that go with it. And so this is a powerful tool for students and for teachers to be able to see how much time passed between each of those events, but often being able to see kind of the cluttering of events during certain historical time periods. Now, timelines are interesting because they're often assigned by teachers and viewed as the powerful tool that they can be. But the question often that students and teachers will have is, what do I do with a timeline after the students create it? How do I actually do more with it to pose that historical inquiry for students? And really, that comes back to the teacher and asking the question, what is the purpose of the timeline and what type of thinking do you want the student to engage in while they're creating that timeline? And so it's more about the delivery and the challenges that are put to the student during the creation of that timeline or the chronology. And so when we look at a timeline like this one here, for United States history from 1790 to 1840, the question I would first pose is what information or insights could be gained from looking at this timeline, seeing events like the Whiskey Rebellion and the Alien and Sedition Act, or the Louisiana Purchase, the War of 1812, right? Or looking at Nat Turner's Rebellion or the Trail of Tears. And so what insights can we gain from history during this time period? And when we look a little bit deeper, we begin to pose the questions of how do we use timelines like this in our social studies classrooms? And so when you first think of what are the insights that could be gained, right, it gives you other areas of inquiry or questions that could be used. And so timelines can very easily be a tool for historical inquiry for students, and they can be the foundation for students to then later go and make a historical argument using evidence and doing research to further that timeline and enhance their own personal learning. So looking back to the timeline then, if we begin to ask ourselves not only the question of what is the impact of that territorial expansion, but for me, when I looked at it, the events that stood out to me brought the question to mind of what is the impact of territorial expansion in the United States during the early 1800s? And once I began to think about that, then posing to students after they come up with their hypothesis for what they think the impact of territorial acquisitions are during that early 1800 time period, what were the events that stood out to them that caused them to, spark these thoughts for whatever it may be that the, acquisition of resources or the displacement of native peoples or whatever it may be for the impact of that territorial expansion. Now, timelines can also be in graphic forms. And so for this one, we've already kind of gone through those first two. I wanted to have you all come up with the question. Now, this timeline is a graphic, 90 seconds, the history of religion throughout the world. And so as you're watching this quick clip, what I would ask is that you try to think of what are some inquiry questions that you could pose using this timeline with your students in your classroom. So after viewing the timeline then, what are the types of questions that you could pose using this timeline with your own students in your class? Now, as you note and you see the timeline evolve, there aren't really that many events that are highlighted, but the timeline itself, even with the silence, speaks volumes. When I watched this quick video for the history of religion, the question that first came to mind for me was, how has the spread of religion coincided with major historical conflicts? Noticing, or the piece from the timeline that stood out, of course, for me, were some of those periods with the Crusades. And this historical inquiry question then could spark students to do a depth or breadth of knowledge that they could then seek on their own with research, and then students could come back and we could debate and discuss that within class. But the timeline really being that foundation or that first piece where they're able to create their own historical hypothesis and research question. Now, for me with timelines and with chronology, really the basics and the importance is that we have to go beyond a basic timeline or chronology. We have to ask our students meaningful questions that help to push them to really be the historians that we want them to be, and try to make our classes interactive, and making sure that they recognize that there are ties between cause and effect, and that we are able to go back and see how over time all of those events relate to one another. And in the end, the hope is that our students then are creating the historical narratives themselves, and that they're able to tell the story for some of the pieces or historical connections that they have made or uncovered for themselves. So when we're looking at how to engage our students, in the end, it's really about involving them in the process, having them do the historical inquiry, focusing on the historical causation with the chronology and the timelines, and then being able to ask them those questions for continuity and change over time. Have things really stayed the same, or when and how have they changed? Also asking them to come up with their own chronological reasoning for why events unfolded in the way that they did. What was that cause and effect relationship, right? And which one really was the precursor to some of those other events? Were they related or were they not related at all? Involving students and allowing them to defend and create their own world position and stance when it comes to some of those areas in history. And then just discussing it, because having those conversations and being exposed to the different viewpoints is really where, for the students, learning from those chronologies and timelines are at. Because for every person, when they look at a timeline, different pieces of the timeline will stand out to each one of them. And so for me, what stood out may be very different than what stood out to you as you looked at some of those timelines, and just being able to discuss those pieces. So in the end, when we're talking about the difference between chronology and timeline, we know that there are similarities because they're all taking events and they're putting them in order from beginning to end. But the differences are very much so rooted in the specifics of scaling and just, is it more breadth or narrowly focused? Each, between chronologies and timelines, has their own individual strengths, and each can be used in different ways within our classroom. But it really, in the end, what's most important is that we go beyond the basics of just having students create a timeline and really having them investigate knowledge and craft questions for inquiry based off of what they can find with those timelines. Because in the end, chronology and timelines are the basis or the foundation for history, and they should really be our tool for inquiry for our students. Now, thank you so much for listening to this first segment on historical causation, chronology versus timelines. The next segment is really going to be focused more on historical causation and actual learning strategy or classroom strategy that you can use called 6 Degrees of Separation. And I'll talk more in depth about that for our next, or in the next segment. Thanks for joining me, and have a wonderful afternoon.